Now, detonate the reality bomb!
I will build a great, great wall.
Some alien race to come down and threaten us.
Is the singularity near?
The truth is out there.
The military-industrial complex.
The 7 mountains of the influencers of culture.
To be as gods, you know.
Change has come to America.
Catapult of propaganda.
From a secure location on top of the ridge in the heart of the beautiful Missouri Ozarks, this is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
The Coyotes are howling. You say they're playing football somewhere? We soldier on nonetheless. The Coyotes are howling. The Dachshund is sleeping, and that means time once again for A View from the Bunker Live tonight. What's going on in Venezuela, and why is this new president that nobody's ever heard of now suddenly the anointed one? Washington Post admits their journalist was a spy. Democrats are losing their minds. Apple smacks down Facebook, causes panic inside Facebook headquarters. Record cold due to global warming and a strange shootout at Area 23. And our guest tonight, the science behind the search for Sodom. Dr. Phillip Silvia, archaeologist, joins us to talk about the search for the biblical city of Sodom. That is all tonight on A View from the Bunker Live for February 3rd of 2019. Welcome. I'm Derek Gilbert. Thank you for joining us tonight. Yes, I know there is a football game happening this evening. They just would not reschedule. I tried, but I'm sorry, you're just going to have to make a choice. So if you're listening tonight live, God bless you, whether that's at Spreaker.com, iHeartRadio, Stitcher.com, Spotify.com, or, of course, at VFTB.net, where the link is right there. You can subscribe to the podcast if you're listening in the archives, and I don't blame you. Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify. We've got links to subscribe to all of those at VFTB.net. But, of course, the easiest way to listen to this program is simply download the free mobile app. Yes, for Google devices, Apple, or let me back up one more time. You can subscribe via the mobile app. Just download it for Android devices from Google Play or get it for your iOS devices at the iTunes App Store. You'll find those links, again, at the website VFTB.net. The audio from these programs archived at our YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/Derek Gilbert. And, of course, social media. Yes, we still do that in spite of the algorithms and the screening and the filtering. Facebook.com/View from the Bunker. We've got a schedule there of upcoming programs. You can also find us on Twitter at View from Bunker or at Derek Gilbert. That's DEREK Gilbert. And we are also now at the new site, oneway.com. Oneway.com at Derek P. Gilbert. Well, what going on in the world this week? It is a strange week that we have been going through. Of course, tonight, the Super Bowl, Los Angeles, New England, kind of a replay of the 20-year-ago Super Bowl, the really exciting one with Kurt Warner and Marshall Faulk and Torrey Holt, Oz Hakim, the greatest show on turf, when Dick Vermeil finally won his Super Bowl for the St. Louis Rams. Of course, St. Louis fans not really happy with the way things have turned out for them this year. After winning that Super Bowl in 1999, they went back in 2001 for a rematch with New England. Head coach then was Mike Martz, was outcoached by Bill Belichick, and the Patriots won a game that they should have lost, but that was kind of the beginning of the end for the St. Louis Rams. They turned into a really awful team, and eventually were moved to Los Angeles, and now doing well. Like I said, St. Louis fans not really happy. In fact, I read this week that somebody there came out with a product that appeared to be doing very well in the run-up to the Super Bowl through the playoffs, a product that was supplied to businesses where there were public restrooms. Essentially, it's that little, thing that goes down in the bottom of the urinal, except this one was adorned with the face of Los Angeles Rams owner Stan Kroenke. So St. Louis fans showing their support, in a manner of speaking, for the Los Angeles Rams. Anyway, CBS making news and helping to elevate the profile of a clothing company, an apparel company, that tried to place a 45-second ad on the CBS broadcast of the Super Bowl this week. It's a company owned by veterans, military veterans, and it was intended as a response to the Nike ad run last year that featured Colin Kaepernick. Kaepernick, of course, the former quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers who famously started the Take a Knee movement during the national anthem. Kaepernick has been unable to find employment in the National Football League over the last 2 seasons. There are those who insist that it's because of institutionalized racism in the NFL. There are others who point to his record in his final year as a starting quarterback with the 49ers, which was something like 1-15. Either way, Nike decided to make him, as divisive as he is, the face of their advertising campaign at the Super Bowl last year. So 9 Line Apparel, this veteran-owned company, decided to respond this year. And CBS said that they were not convinced that 9 Line Apparel could pay for the 45-second advertisement. Despite the fact that 9 Line Apparel, which I had not heard of prior to this, has annual revenues in excess of, on the high side of $25 million. Now, buying advertising during the Super Bowl isn't cheap, but, you know, if you're pulling in $25 million in revenue over the course of a year, you probably could pay for one. But CBS said no. The ad is narrated by a United States Marine who was a survivor of the Benghazi debacle. And during the ad, he says, "Some people think you're crazy for not being loyal, defending the Constitution, standing for the flag. Then I guess I'm crazy. For those who kneel, they fail to understand that they can kneel, that they can protest, that they can despise what I stand for, even hate the truth that I speak. But they can only do that because I am crazy enough." Again, a response to the Nike ad featuring Colin Kaepernick last year. Well, the CEO of 9 Line Apparel, Tyler Merritt, ripped CBS for rejecting the ad. He's not buying the excuse that it was because they didn't believe the credit references. Over 100,000 views on the YouTube video of 9 Line Apparel's ad so far as of earlier this evening. So if you do a quick search at YouTube, you can find it. 9 Line Apparel. Pretty well done ad. And it's the kind of thing that makes me think, yeah, maybe I'm, look into buying some of their clothes. So the other big thing going on the last couple of weeks, and this is something that always gets my radar, my spidey sense, to steal a phrase, tingling. It's when you see Republicans and Democrats, conservative and liberal, and bear in mind, all of those words have air quotes around them, agreeing that, on one particular aspect of foreign policy, and that is that Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, has to go. Now, let me say up front, I'm not a supporter of Maduro or his predecessor in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez. Socialism is, well, it's evil. It just is. There is no system of, there is no perfect system of government or economics. But it's not because the system, in most cases, it's not because of the systems themselves. It's because of the sin in the human heart. And the success of any government system, political system, or economic system, in my view, is determined by how well it puts limits on how much damage sin can do, which is why a decentralized government like that in the United States, that designed by the framers of the Constitution, although imperfect, is still the best system going. Why capitalism, even though it is imperfect, is still a better solution than collectivism, and all of us sending our stuff into a central authority and then letting that authority dole out what they decide everybody needs. The imperfections in the system are not due to the system in capitalism. It's due to the greed that is inherent in the human heart. So, I carry no water for socialists, for Chavez, or for Maduro. But when you get CNN and the New York Post, or New York Times rather, on the one side, Washington Post and other liberal media outlets, just slamming the socialist government of Maduro there, and rushing to acknowledge this young man, Juan Guaido, as the legitimate president of Venezuela, you just have to ask, now, wait a minute, whoa, what's going on here? Because at the same time, you've got conservatives saying the same thing. Conservative media like Fox News, Wall Street Journal, rushing to declare Guaido the legitimate ruler of Venezuela. Because it appears, and I will confess, I've not had the time over the last couple of weeks to do in-depth digging here. I'm just giving you the reasons why I'm not really sold on the idea that Guaido represents a legitimate consensus choice of the people as a ruler there. I mean, we may be seeing a wag the dog scenario taking place in Venezuela. Now, there are some who will say that before about 2 weeks ago, fewer than 20% of Venezuelans even knew who Juan Guaido even was. I don't know that that's true for a fact. I'm just reporting from sources that I believe to be reputable. But again, I've been working real hard to try to finish my next book, and so all of my extra time has been kind of devoted to trying to finish the manuscript and start on the editing process. But sources that have been reputable in the past or reliable in the past suggest that Guaido was pretty much an unknown, a nobody in Venezuelan politics until a couple of weeks ago. He was a consensus choice of the opposition parties in the National Assembly in Venezuela. A compromise choice. He was not the choice that any one particular party wanted. He seemed like the least bad option, apparently, in order to put together a coalition to stand up to Nicolas Maduro, who is who won re-election, an election that has been condemned by the United States and our allies as illegitimate because of vote fraud. So, after a phone call from Vice President Mike Pence, 35-year-old Juan Guaido suddenly has been declared the legitimate president of Venezuela. And earlier this week, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced that the United States was turning over control of certain government bank accounts, Venezuelan government bank accounts that are held in the United States, to Juan Guaido. Again, you just got to ask why. Who's behind this guy? Where did he come from? Why are we supporting it? Now, we supported, I say we, the United States government supported a coup attempt against Chavez some years ago prior to his death. Maduro was Chavez's handpicked successor. And we kind of left him alone for his first 6-year term, maybe thinking that, okay, well, we'll give him one term and hopefully he'll be, tossed out after the first election. That didn't happen. So now suddenly people are taking to the streets, and this guy who was reportedly just a backbencher in the National Assembly until a couple of weeks ago is now being declared the leader of the country that has the largest oil reserves on planet Earth. Now, you probably thought it was Saudi Arabia. So did I. No, it's Venezuela. Now, the United States is on track. If we continue to drill and find new reserves, exploitable reserves, we will become the largest oil reserves in the world here. But it's not about controlling our own destiny as far as what the United States needs for its own energy use. It's keeping Venezuela's energy reserves out of the hands of China and Russia. Because until something economically competitive comes along, oil is the coin of the realm. And it will be for the foreseeable future. Yeah, battery-operated cars are a great idea, but until somebody comes up with a solar-powered airliner, we're going to be using fossil fuels for a long time. This so-called Green New Deal being pushed by radical Democrats, I'm sorry, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, but until you can figure out a way to fly airliners back and forth across the country and across the world that don't use fossil fuels, we ain't going to give up the fossil fuels. It's just not practical. Now, here's the big question for Americans to think about. Pat Buchanan, who the older I get, the more I realize Buchanan was right about a lot of stuff. What happens if the military in Venezuela, the soldiers there, decide to stick with Maduro? Are we going to back Juan Guaido if the military in Venezuela sticks with Maduro? Are we really going to invade Venezuela? I mean, there's some question about that because of a press conference early in the week where National Security Advisor John Bolton accidentally, or maybe accidentally on purpose, let reporters get a look at a legal pad that he was carrying on which he had scribbled the note 5,000 troops to Colombia. Now, Colombia shares about a 1,300-mile border with Venezuela. So any military action we might take into Venezuela would probably come from across the border in Colombia. Colombia's ambassador to the United States said, we don't know anything about this. So did Bolton make a mistake? I don't know. He's a pretty old hand in Washington, D.C. Making that kind of a mistake seems unlikely. So we'll see what happens, but just remember, what is really going on there, and are we really going to fight for it if the military decides to stick with Nicolas Maduro? Something I missed toward the end of December, and I'm sorry I did, because I think this is kind of important. The United States and a lot of our politicians all up in arms about the disappearance and murder of Jamal Khashoggi. You might remember back in October, he went into the Saudi consulate in Turkey, reportedly to get documents he needed to marry somebody. And this is beginning to look and sound like a honeypot type of thing. Like he was lured into this by a woman who, according to what I've read, didn't seem all that broken up, that he just sort of disappeared into the Saudi consulate. Anyway, Jamal Khashoggi was described in American media reports as an American journalist or a journalist for the Washington Post, a U.S.-based journalist. Now, it's known, and I've talked about this before on this program, how Khashoggi and his family have had connections at the highest levels of the Saudi government for a long, long time. In fact, Khashoggi's uncle was a notorious weapons dealer back in the 70s and 80s, one of the wealthiest men in the world. Well, the Washington Post, in an article that it ran about Khashoggi's final month as an exile from Saudi Arabia, admitted way down in the article that, and I'm going to quote from the article now because this is interesting, perhaps most problematic for Khashoggi were his connections to an organization funded by Saudi Arabia's regional nemesis, Qatar. Text messages between Khashoggi and an executive at Qatar Foundation International show that the executive, Maggie Mitchell-Salem, at times shaped the columns he submitted to the Washington Post, proposing topics, drafting material, and prodding him to take a harder line against the Saudi government. Khashoggi also appears to have relied on a researcher and translator affiliated with the organization, which promotes Arabic language education in the United States. In other words, he was acting as a paid agent for the government of Qatar, which is a rival to the Saudis. They were writing his material, telling him what to write, and giving him research and translation help. And the Washington Post said, we had no idea. So, look, the fact that he was murdered is not defensible. I'm not trying to defend that. I'm just saying there's more layers to this story than were spun out in the U.S. media. Calling him a journalist, Jamal Khashoggi, isn't telling the whole story. Wheels within wheels, he was working as an intel asset, a disinfo agent or misinfo agent for the government of Qatar. No. Moving on, here in the United States, this was a week that we realized for sure that the Democratic Party is losing its mind as the state of New York, we'd previously discussed how they legalized abortion right up till the moment of birth, third trimester abortions, celebrated by lighting up a bunch of public buildings that are pink. This week, the governor of Virginia, in discussing a bill that was proposed before the Virginia Assembly by Delegate Kathy Tran, said that, and I quote now, this is an interview at WTOP Radio, the infant would be resuscitated if that's what the mother and the family desired, and then a discussion would ensue between the physicians and mother. End quote. Governor Northam said that the child could be born and then mother and doctor could make a decision about whether or not to allow it to live. Make no mistake, this is infanticide. Now, Kathy Tran, in a question and answer session in a session of the Virginia Assembly, said that the mother could be dilating. In other words, the baby had been carried full term, was about to be born, and then the mother could say, okay, nope, I would like to change my mind. Let's not deliver a live infant. This is reprehensible. And I think the Democrats have realized that they've overstepped here. That this just really isn't going to play well in the 2020 elections. Running on infanticide as a political platform, even in 21st century America, is not going to go over well. The bill, as Tran put forward, would eliminate the requirement that an abortion in the second trimester of pregnancy and prior to the third trimester be performed in a hospital. Could be done in an outpatient setting, a Planned Parenthood clinic, in other words, that would not be required to meet the standards required of hospitals. I'm sorry, I mean, this is surgery. You would hope that they would meet the same standards as a hospital, but because, well, that costs money, that presents an obstacle to doing what we want done, which is terminating the life of a child, this bill would eliminate that requirement. Also eliminate all the procedures and processes, including the performance of an ultrasound required to effect a woman's informed written consent to the performance of an abortion. However, it doesn't change the requirement that a woman's informed written consent first be obtained. She's still got to, sign that, yes, she really wants to do this, but don't show her a picture of the unborn baby because that might make her change her mind. The bill, as presented, would also eliminate the requirement that 2 other physicians certify that a third trimester abortion is necessary to prevent the woman's death or impairment of her mental or physical health, as well as the need to find that any such impairment to the woman's health would be substantial and irremediable. In other words, you wouldn't need a panel of doctors to say, yeah, we concur that unless this child is terminated, the mother's health will be irremediably harmed. Find one guy or woman who say, oh yeah, this will cause mental issues, a lot of stress, so we need to terminate. Again, that's what Ms. Tran's bill would do. It would also remove language classifying facilities that perform 5 or more first trimester abortions per month as hospitals, for the purpose of complying with regulations establishing minimum standards for hospitals. Now, to its credit, the Virginia Assembly has tabled the bill. The subcommittee to which this bill was introduced has tabled the bill, so it's not being considered now. But interestingly, the Democratic Party, Ms. Tran, in fact, recorded about a 90-second video claiming that she was being taken out of context by radical pro-life activists, when all that was happening was her words were being quoted, and Governor Northam's words were being quoted. Interestingly now, Governor Northam is under fire for a yearbook photo taken in 1984. And a lot of this criticism is coming from Democrats. Kamala Harris, senator from California and presidential candidate, calling on Governor Northam to resign, step down, because of a photo that appears to show a Ralph Northam 35 years ago dressed in blackface as Michael Jackson, apparently, for some Halloween party or something. So the question is this: why couldn't the Republican challenger in the recent gubernatorial election find this picture? Because the Democrats found it quick enough as soon as they needed it. Governor Northam, you're an embarrassment. You let the cat out of the bag that we actually support infanticide, so you have to go. Well, he's refusing to step down. We'll see how this develops. But like I said, Democrats losing their minds. But this is the goal of the pro-abortion activists. Unrestricted ability to sacrifice children, to perform the sacrifice to Molech. Speaking of politics, the Democratic field is getting more crowded. Oh, by the way, a pro-abortion activist this past week Amelia Bono, who's the co-founder of hashtag Shout Your Abortion, was featured on an episode of a kids video program on YouTube called Kids Meet. Her episode was titled Kids Meet Someone Who Has Had an Abortion. And Ms. Bono said that having an abortion is part of God's plan. And it's like having just a really crappy dentist's appointment. Programming our children. It's no worse than going to the dentist. Well, as bad as things are, with New York passing this bill, legalizing the third trimester abortions, that just makes them state number 8. There are 7 other states and our nation's capital that already allow third trimester abortions. Alaska, Colorado, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New Mexico, Oregon, and Vermont, as well as Washington, D.C. Democratic field getting crowded. Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey has announced he will be running for president in 2020. This will be interesting. Cory Spartacus Booker, Tears of Rage Booker. Senator Booker, who leaked confidential emails to the press and should have been censured by the Senate, if not kicked out for what he did. But he didn't. So we'll see. I don't think Booker is going to get the support from the Democratic Party that he would like. He is a little too corporate friendly for the direction of the Democratic Party in 2018, 2019. Elsewhere in the race there among the Democrats, Senator Elizabeth Warren has apologized to the Cherokee people for going forward public with that DNA test that showed that she was 1028th or 2056th possibly Native American, and maybe not even Native North American, could have been Native South American. We don't know. Anyway, the Cherokees kind of were like, well, yeah, we appreciate her effort there. So we'll see. I, again, don't see the gravitas there needed to win. Kamala Harris, maybe. Howard Schultz, who is a former CEO of Starbucks, guy who worked his way up from the projects in New York to become a billionaire, is kind of tracking with our statement tonight that the Democratic Party has lost its collective mind. He is a billionaire, and when he's got people inside the party saying, we need to tax rich people 70% of their earnings above whatever, $1 million, or 90% even. Well, Schultz is like, hey, wait a minute. That's a bad idea. And obviously he's got a personal reason for not wanting to have the greater part of his wealth taken away in income taxes. But he also understands that it's a disincentive to productive people to get out there and work hard. And we talked about this, was it last week or the week before? The example from France. France tried this under Francois Hollande. And they found that what happened was rich people have the resources and the creativity or the business acumen to figure out ways to avoid paying a lot in income taxes. There are ways they can do it. They, get creative with their tax returns, or they just pack up and move. Like the actor Gerard Depardieu, who went to Belgium and then went to Russia and is now a Russian citizen because France instituted a 75% tax on earnings of over, €1 million or something. So anyway, Howard Schultz may run as an independent because he doesn't feel has a home in the Democratic Party anymore. But interestingly, even though he is a liberal, he supports progressive causes, except when it comes to, high income taxes on the wealthy, had an event at a Barnes & Noble in New York City Monday night, and he was heckled. People yelling at him, calling him, names that I cannot repeat on this program, or prefer not to anyway, because they think if Howard Schultz runs, he may have the name recognition and the financial resources, the money, to advertise enough to draw enough votes away from the Democratic nominee as a third-party candidate that he could get Donald Trump reelected. In other words, he would be the left's version of Ross Perot in 2020 if he runs. And so they're already trying to nip that in the bud. We will see. Another wealthy New Yorker, Michael Bloomberg, former New York City mayor, reportedly has put together a secret team and will be financing an effort aimed at unseating Donald Trump in the 2020 election. And, Hillary Clinton, according to the Wall Street Journal, CNN political correspondent Jeff Salaney reported this week that Hillary Clinton is considering a third try at the White House. Oh, please. Oh, please. Well, just remember, it's all a show. It's all a show. One final note this week, and I bring this up because I think this is disturbing. Facebook reportedly deliberately ignored developer guidelines set by Apple for its iOS operating system. That's the system that runs iPads, iPhones, iPod Touch, if you've got one of those still. Facebook had gotten slapped last year, toward the end of the year, November, December, for putting out an app that was data mining. And Apple said, no, you can't do that. We don't want you to do that. So please, withdraw this app. Facebook did, but then they bypassed the App Store and bypassed the guidelines and offered out an app aimed at teen users that essentially bribed them to allow Facebook to suck up all of the user data. I mean, all of the private data contained on that mobile device. Contacts, emails, messages, Snapchat, whatever. Facebook was pulling it all in. Again, in violation of iOS terms for developers. So Apple this week revoked the developer certificate for Facebook. Now, what that did was prevented Facebook employees from sideloading beta versions of their mobile apps to test inside Facebook headquarters. So a lot of these folks went into work on Tuesday, and suddenly their version of Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, Instagram, whatever, suddenly wouldn't work anymore. But the fact that Facebook has been caught again showing no regard whatsoever for the privacy of its users should alarm all of us. Now, having said that, okay, I know we use Facebook Messenger, probably post way too much stuff myself because, that's where people are, and we want people to find out what we're doing and what we're talking about, get our message out there. But just bear in mind, if you got kids or grandkids out there who don't understand that there are predators out there who will gladly use that information, you need to be aware that it's out there in hands that you don't know, but also that Facebook is taking all that information and using it to develop profiles for, all of us, basically, based on information that we would never have willingly given up to the government even just a few years ago. So this will be interesting. Now, Apple didn't pull the ultimate sanction and bar Facebook apps from the App Store, but who knows whether that might be on the horizon at some point. But again, after Facebook being caught time after time after time abusing the privacy and the personal data of its users, what's it going to take for us to just say, that's it, we're not using it anymore? Yeah, I don't know. Well, coming up, we're going to look at discuss the physical evidence for one of the most spectacular events of the Old Testament. Physical evidence of the destruction of Sodom, Gomorrah, and the cities of the plain. That's straight ahead on A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert.
Millions of people from around the globe were stunned when U.S. President Donald Trump shocked the world by recognizing Jerusalem as the eternal capital of Israel and ordering the American embassy to be moved there.
The United States finally and officially recognized Jerusalem as the true capital of Israel and opened our embassy in the historic and sacred land of Jerusalem.
Over 2,000 years have elapsed since Jesus Christ warned of a day when a man of sin, the Antichrist, would appear to lead the world into deception and destruction.
Even Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu admits that biblical prophecies are unfolding, that Donald Trump is a King Cyrus-like figure leading the world into a new era of man.
President Trump, by recognizing history, you have made history. The Temple Mount is in our hands.
Violent protests continued in the Middle East today over President Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital.
And now the official Sanhedrin in Israel declare President Trump is advancing a prophetic process that will usher in, when the time comes, the rebuilding of the Third Temple.
As the world awaits, a secret, incendiary scheme is underway by religious authorities, government agents, and Jewish rabbis to build a third temple.
When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in that holy place, then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be again.
The rabbis, Donald Trump, and the top secret plan to build the third temple.
One man, a microphone, and a deep psychological need to tell the world what he thinks. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Coming up in our final segment tonight, we'll discuss the weather, which, as you probably heard multiple times this week, is not climate. And that's supposed to explain why Chicago was colder than Antarctica this week, because, of course, the Earth is getting warmer. And we'll talk about a strange shootout in the desert at Area 23 this week. What was that all about? Well, again, that's coming up in our final segment tonight after 8:30 p.m. It's not often that scientific papers delivered to a group of academics, especially specialists in the archaeology of the ancient Near East, will make a splash in mainstream media. But that is exactly what happened with our guest this week. He delivered a paper to the American Schools of Oriental Research in November, and one journalist was present. His story was picked up on and expanded by the mainstream media into perhaps more than what was delivered, but we'll find out more about that. Our guest is a field archaeologist. He's the supervisor and director of scientific analysis for the Tal el-Hammam Excavation Project, which is a site in Jordan very near the Dead Sea. He represents Trinity Southwest University in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We are honored to welcome Dr. Phillip Silvia to the program. Phil, thank you for taking time out of your schedule today.
My pleasure, Derek. Glad we could get together for this.
So, Tal el-Hammam, what is it, where is it, and why is this a significant dig site?
Okay, Tal el-Hammam is in the Great Rift Valley, so it's in that circular plain immediately north of the Dead Sea. We are about 14 kilometers northeast, or about 6.5 miles northeast of the Dead Sea. So we're right up against the eastern edge of the, I guess you could call it the cliffside, which is the valley wall that takes you up to the Jordan Plateau. It's a significant site because it is by far the largest site in the southern Levant. At its peak during the Middle Bronze Age, there was only one other site comparable in size, and that would be Hatzor, that's up further north, closer to the Sea of Galilee. So it was a very dominant Middle Bronze Age urban center.
Okay, so Middle Bronze Age, for people not familiar with that time scale, when would that be BC?
Okay, well, as far as we are concerned, the terminal event that destroyed the site happened in 1700 BC.
Okay.
In terms of the biblical timeline, we are right in the wheelhouse of the time frame of the whole Abraham and Lot narrative. So we're in the patriarchal period as Abraham is coming into the land with his nephew Lot.
Okay, so there's an event that destroyed this site around the time of Abraham and Lot.
Correct.
Okay. All right. People's ears are already beginning to pick up. But this was a big site. Now, Hazor was considered the capital when the Israelites came back some 300 years later, 200 and some odd years later. The largest city in northern Canaan. So this site, Tal el-Hammam, was comparable to Hazor in later days.
Actually, at the time of the destruction event, they were almost identical in size. After Tal el-Hammam went offline in 1700 BC. Hatzor continued to grow and grew substantially. I wouldn't go so far as to call it a capital per se, because the Canaanites were not an organized nation. They were a loose confederation of urban centers. But it certainly was the dominant urban center of the region of Canaan, yes.
Okay. So this was an important city, probably connected to trade. If it was it on the King's Highway then? Would it have been connected to trade from, say, Arabia or Egypt and the rest of Mesopotamia?
Oh, absolutely. Tal el-Hammam was one of the main crossroads. If you can picture the Dead Sea in your mind and picture a circular plain at the north end of the Dead Sea, on the west you have Jericho. And it was at the crossroads of the main north-south trade route that went up the west side of the Jordan River. And Tal el-Hammam is on the main trade route that went up the east side of the Jordan River. There was a connecting path, road, trail, whatever you want to call it, between Tal el-Hammam and Jordan. So these two cities controlled all of the commerce that traveled the King's Highway up the east side or on the west side up through the western bank of the Jordan River. Jericho, however, was much, much smaller. Tal el-Hammam, in the meantime, was a 600-pound gorilla sitting in the middle of the valley. It's a very large site, measuring almost 1,000 meters long and 600 meters wide, encompassing about 64 acres within the perimeter of the fortification walls that went around the city. And when you add all of the villages and towns and the agricultural fields, we're well over 100 acres. So it's a very large site.
Any estimate as to how many people would have lived there?
We're estimating that within the urban footprint of Tal el-Hammam that there was perhaps as many as 45,000. You might stretch it up to 60,000, but I think that's a stretch. So we're talking a substantial urban center of about 45,000 people in 1700 BC.
That's more people than live in our county here in southwest Missouri. So what was it that attracted your attention, that drew you to Trinity Southwest University and the project there at Tal el-Hammam?
Well, what drew me to the school was actually my wife putting a foot in my back as I was approaching retirement age and suggested that I go do something with all of the independent research that I've been doing for about 40 years. And what I had been researching primarily is what I call catastrophic language in the Old Testament, which basically deals with the writers of the Old Testament who did not have the scientific understanding that we have today, did not have the vocabulary that we have today, still were experiencing things in real life, and they wanted to write those experiences down. And because they didn't have the vocabulary to do it, they used a lot of similes. So I'll give you a very quick example. So David writes about hills skipping like gazelles and mountains melting like wax. And so my question is, what does that mean? And I'll give you the short form of the story. Basically, it means he's talking about major earthquake activity, hills skipping like gazelles, and he's talking about massive landslides, mountains melting like wax. That's what it appeared like to him. But he didn't understand plate tectonics. He didn't have the vocabulary to talk about that. So he uses similes that he can convey to his readers what it is he's seeing. And that's catastrophic language in the Old Testament.
And this has been something that you found intriguing for quite some time.
Yes, yeah. And like I said, I've been studying it for about 40 years as I was approaching retirement age. And my wife said, go do something with it. So she encouraged me to go get a doctorate. That led me to Trinity Southwest University. And originally I was wanting to do a doctor of theology, a THD. And I told Dr. Collins when I met him, he's the dean of the school, the executive dean, or was at the time. And I told him I wanted to do a study on catastrophic language in the Old Testament and how catastrophism helped shape the theological development of ancient Israel. And he said, fine, set the second part aside for your second book. Focus on the first part and use Tal el-Hammam as your example, because he thought Tal el-Hammam was Sodom. And, of course, the Sodom narrative is one of those catastrophic events. So I'm already on that page, and that's how I got involved. Didn't know until I got to Tal el-Hammam for the first time in 2012 that, wow, this is where I need to be.
Now, what was it that you discovered at Tal el-Hammam that you found so fascinating then?
Well, initially, what I found was the alignment of stacked foundations in the sacred precinct of the site, because that was something that I had read about, studied about, mostly from Egypt. This is the first time I'm actually seeing it in the ground, so that caught my attention. But as time went on, and as we started to collect the physical evidence from the site, we started encountering objects that defied explanation from normal human activity. Things such as what we describe as vitrified pottery, or pottery that the surface has been melted to glass. When that piece was first found, we said, what is vitrified pottery doing in a sealed Middle Bronze Age context? Because glazed pottery did not get introduced into the area until about 600 AD.
Okay.
And we're in a context that dates to 1700 BC. And so we're looking, Dr. Collins, who found that piece, is looking at this piece and tried to figure out what it was. So he sent it off to New Mexico Tech, down in Socorro, New Mexico, and they examined it under their scanning electron microscope and discovered that we had a 5 millimeter thick, about a quarter inch thick, but I'm going to speak millimeters for a moment because it's easy to describe this, 5 millimeter thick piece of pottery. The top or outer 1 millimeter was melted glass. The next 2 millimeters down were thermally darkened, and then the bottom 2 millimeters were the normal color. We're trying to figure out, how did that happen? Because that was beyond the capability of people in 1700 BC. That wasn't a capability to do that. So that's when they started to understand that we have a thermal profile here that cannot be explained through human activity that created this particular broken piece of pottery. And so that just raises all kinds of questions. We looked at the ground and we noticed particularly our tell is what we call bi-level. It's got an upper tell, the Acropolis, and then it's got a lower tell. And there's about 100 feet difference in elevation. So the lower tell about 100 feet higher than the surrounding plain. The upper tell is another 100 feet higher than that. On the lower tell, we'd be digging in the dirt. It'd be normal brown dirt during the day. We'd go home at night. We'd come back in the morning, and there'd be a white haze over the ground. And we tried to figure out, what is that coming from? And so that led to some soil analysis to figure out what's going on. It turned out to be the lower tell is saturated with basically salts from the Dead Sea, from Dead Sea water.
Huh.
So how did that happen? There's only 3 other sites on our side of the river that have been excavated, and all 3 of those other sites have the exact same occupational profile as our site. They were all founded back in the early Chalcolithic, late Neolithic period, so about 4500 BC. They've been continuously occupied right up through and including the Middle Bronze Age, and then every single site in the area went offline at the same time. They were all destroyed, all in the same way, and it was not by conquest. So that raises a question: how did that happen? How did our site get saturated with Dead Sea water? What kind of thermal profile was needed in order to melt the outer surface of this piece of pottery? And we found other pieces since then. So all of these questions started to come together to say, okay, we need to understand what was the event that occurred here to create all of this physical evidence that we're looking at, and what prevented people from living here for the next 600 years after that destruction event.
So the destruction was so complete that this area north of the Dead Sea was basically wiped out, just depopulated for centuries.
Yes, 6 to 7 centuries, exactly.
Wow.
Especially on the east side. Now, Jericho came back small, but Jericho came back after a few hundred years, and so it recreated itself just in time for Joshua to take it out later in the late Bronze Age.
Right.
But the east side, where we were, urban centers did not get reestablished there until the early Iron Age. So the time of Solomon, basically, is when people started moving back there. And what we've discovered on our site, coincidentally, and by the way, Let me just say that we're not setting out to prove the Bible because we believe the Bible is true. But on the other hand, everything that we're finding is so consistent with the biblical text, it's just astounding. What we found at our site is during the Iron Age, people came back, and our site apparently became one of those unnamed store cities during the period of Solomon and later. There are actually 4 kings in the Old Testament, starting with Solomon, who are credited with having built store cities in the land. And ours apparently was one of them, because we found that during the Iron Age 2 specifically, they started drilling what we call silos. When we talk about silos, we think of a structure that's standing up above the ground. A silo in this period was a hole dug in the ground, and they lined it with stones and sometimes plastered it, and that's where they would store their grain underground.
Right.
In these cylindrical pits called silos. We've already identified over 24 silos that were dug into the upper tell, right through the rampart wall, in some cases right through the foundation walls and lined with stones. And they were all done during the Iron Age. And a couple of years ago, we discovered an Iron Age warehouse on the upper tell where they would store the processed grain. And so our site came back online, and the other sites around us came back online during the early Iron Age. Well, this is about 600 to 700 years after the destruction event. So what happened that prevented people from living there for almost 7 centuries? And these are the kinds of questions that are going through our mind as we are discovering more and more material that is just uncharacteristic coming out of the Middle Bronze Age destruction layer. Uncharacteristic for human activity during that period.
Now, the reporter for Science News, Bruce Bauer, in his report, didn't, and I'll put a link to this in the show notes, by the way, so that listeners can view this article themselves and then compare it against the mainstream news sites and how they interpreted what Mr. Bauer wrote. Did not mention Sodom by name. He stuck to... now, was that because you didn't mention Sodom during your presentation at the ASOR meeting?
That is correct. I purposefully did not talk about Sodom. I talked about our site, Tal el-Hammam, and I talked about the physical evidence that we're finding. You have to understand that for the archaeological community to consider a destruction event involving a meteoritic airburst, that is like new turf for archaeologists. They spend their time looking down into the ground. They don't spend their time looking up into the sky. And so I was trying to present for the first time publicly the preliminary conclusions that we are drawing from our investigation and from our analysis of the materials we're recovering, and to build a case for the possibility that not only our site, but the entire region was destroyed by a meteoritic airburst event. Well, that's kind of mind-blowing for archaeologists who never look up, they're always looking down. And I did not want to encumber that story with throwing a biblical spin on it by saying, and oh, by the way, this was Sodom. Because half of the archaeologists, well, more than half the archaeologists of the world, first of all, they're not necessarily Bible-believing people, and most of them think that especially the Pentateuch and maybe even the first 7 books, up and including 1 Samuel, are all based on myth and legend.
Right.
And in fact, what's really sad is that there's been over 24 articles that have been spawned since the original article that appeared in Science News. And you can see the attitude of some of the writers when they say, well, we finally have a physical explanation for the myth of Sodom or the legend of Sodom. So yeah, I didn't want to go there, so I purposefully did not talk about Sodom.
Mm-hmm.
And I stuck to the science.
Well, and he did mention the Tunguska Event from 1908, which I thought was really interesting because that has baffled scientists, but also conspiracy theorists for years. It's another one of those, well, we don't know what it was, so it must have been aliens sort of events.
Yeah.
So how do you then research this? I mean, what do you look for? I mean, you mentioned the vitrified pottery, but then how do you go about trying to confirm a theory like this? I mean, it's not like this is something you can replicate in a laboratory? Let's explode a meteorite over the lab and see what happens. What would you look for?
Well, there's several things, but I do believe we are dealing with a Tunguska-class event. And at least so far, this is the only known Tunguska-class meteoritic airburst event that occurred over a populated urban area, which is significant. Now, what you start looking for is when you start I've mentioned several of the dots already. Let me connect some of those dots for you. Okay, first of all, we have a highly destructive event. How do we know that? We know that because of the physical condition of the Middle Bronze Age destruction layer on the site. If you can picture, probably for Americans, you think of an adobe building, a mud brick building. Well, during this period of time, in that location, they would build mud brick structures on fieldstone foundations. And so the fieldstone foundations would be set into the ground, and then they would erect their mud brick superstructures on top of it, and that was their housing. Very much like the Native American pueblos that we have here in New Mexico. If you want to see what one looks like, come to New Mexico and go visit some of our pueblos, and you can see what an adobe building looks like. And that's what they had. Well, there are no standing structures left anywhere on the lower tell. All we have left is foundations from the Middle Bronze Age. We have a couple of structures that were built in the Iron Age, but basically the entire lower tell was completely blown off of its foundations by this event. And what's significant is we know it was not an earthquake because we can see evidence of earthquake damage in the earlier material from the early Bronze Age and earlier. We can see evidence in foundations where there was earthquake event and repairs made. But from the Middle Bronze Age, when you have an earthquake, the ground is moving back and forth, and so walls fall down in both directions, in all directions. But our event in the Middle Bronze Age, everything fell down in one direction.
Okay.
Which means, we're talking about potentially here a blast front, a unidirectional surge of energy, concussive force that was enough to knock the mud brick superstructures of the mostly residential lower tell off of their foundations and reduce them to just rubble and dust. We have very, very few sections of wall fallen in place. Very few and very small. Now, on the upper tell, we have these massive mud brick rampart walls that go up the sides of the upper tell at a very steep angle. And you also have the Acropolis up there. So you had the King's Palace up there with very thick mud walls. The palace walls are 1.2 meters thick. So they were almost 4 feet thick, really massive mud brick walls. But yet everything that was above what we would project as the height of the rampart walls was sheared off.
Wow.
So based on the thickness of the palace walls, we were assuming we're looking at a 3 to 4 story mud brick structure. All we have left sitting on stone foundation up there of these 4 foot thick walls are maybe 5 to 7 courses of brick. Everything else is sheared off. Wow. So anything that projected above the rampart walls was also torn off on the upper tell. So there was a massive concussive force that hit the area. That's point one. Now we have to deal with, the vitrified pottery, and not just the one piece, but several pieces that we found now. How do you explain that? We're talking about a pretty extreme thermal profile, and we're starting to get a feel for it. So, and I want to be a little careful throwing around numbers here, but when we examined the melted glass surface on that piece of pottery, what we found, and we're examining it under the scanning electron microscope, what we found is that embedded within the glass are melted zircons, which is basically a zinc-based mineral. The melting temperature of the zircon is close to 2,000 degrees, 2,000 to 2,200 degrees in that range. But when we looked at it even more carefully, I mentioned earlier that we first looked at it on the scanning electron microscopes at New Mexico Tech. Well, we have another team looking at it now in North Carolina with a more powerful scanning electron microscope. And when they looked at the same melted zircon, what they found is they call them vesicles rather, in the melted crystal. And what that means is it's filled with tiny little holes. And those little tiny holes are created by the actual melted crystal beginning to boil and to go from the solid to the liquid to the gas state.
Wow.
And so this actually began to boil the crystal. So now we're talking about temperatures that are closer to 4,000 degrees. So it raises the question in your mind, all right, you've got a 5 millimeter thick piece of material that the outer 1 millimeter was melted to glass, where at least momentarily that surface got up to 4,000 degrees to not only melt but actually boil the zircon. But yet the whole piece didn't melt down.
That was my question. Then how is it possible that only that outer millimeter and not the whole piece all the way through? I mean, was it just happened so quickly that the inside surface didn't have enough time to get that hot?
Well, you've got two factors going on. One is you have to have an extremely high thermal profile to get it that hot,
right.
But it had to be an extremely short duration so that only the outer surface was affected and the whole thing didn't melt down. So what are those two numbers? We don't know yet. We just, as a result, one of the nice things about all of these articles is I had a fellow who I'm going to leave unnamed for now until he's ready to have his involvement be made public. But at any rate, I had a material scientist reach out to me who has the capability of, he thinks, of actually replicating that.
Oh.
And so now we're looking forward to maybe getting some temperature and time profiles that would be required to produce this. But let's go back to an airburst event. All right. Mm-hmm. Now we're starting to collect some of these dots. All right. Very concussive event. Very high thermal profile. I mentioned Chelyabinsk earlier in February of 2013. That was estimated at 500 kiloton or 500,000 pound TNT equivalent explosion in the air at an altitude of 12 kilometers. And thankfully, because it was over an urban center, it was high enough and small enough that the only damage they experienced, I say that lightly here, tongue-in-cheek, they had the windows blown out of 6,000 buildings. The roof of a zinc factory collapsed. Nobody was killed. Mm-hmm. About 1,600 people sought medical attention. Only 120 were actually hospitalized. Nobody died from it. The symptoms that they were looking at were basically the equivalent of flash burns, were like a sunburn effect. Mm-hmm. Temporary blindness, flash blindness again, temporary deafness from basically the sonic boom and the concussive sound of the blast. So that was 500 kilotons, 12 kilometers up. Had it been lower, there would have been a lot of dead people. And most of the people went because they suffered cuts from the glass that was blown out of the windows.
Okay. Well, yeah, that makes sense.
Right. Now go back to September of 1908. That's when the Tunguska Event happened. That event happened over relatively sparse inhabited northern Siberia, over a pine forest. That airburst is estimated between 20 and 30 megatons, million tons of TNT at a burst altitude of 10 kilometers. It flattened an area of forest that footprint would entirely encompass the modern city of Rome. If that had happened over Rome, there would be no Rome.
Yeah.
But thankfully, it happened over a forest. And it blew the trees down. The trees that were immediately at ground zero underneath this event, still standing trunks, but the branches stripped right off of it. Flash burns on the bark. Branches stripped off of the other trees, and the other trees were laid radially outward from the epicenter. Just a massive event. So we think we're in that class. Now, so we've got a big thermal profile, highly concussive event. Now we have to explain, so that explains for me the directionality of the fact that all of our walls were blown off in one direction. It explains for me the reason why it was not just our site, but the area, the whole region that got blown down. And we're talking about a footprint that's roughly 500 square miles. Let me think. It's 25 kilometers. So what's pi r squared? Radius is 13. You can figure it out from there. A 13-kilometer radius is the size of this circular plane that got wiped out in this area. So that's the footprint. Whereas the Tunguska event was 2,200 square kilometers. So we're a smaller footprint than Tunguska, but yet equally as intense. Then we have to explain so we have a directionality, and just as an by the way, all of the walls were blown in the northeast direction.
Huh.
Okay? So hold that thought in mind. The next thing is how do we explain the fact that the lower tell seems to have been saturated with water from the Dead Sea when we've never been underwater, and especially not at the intensity of the chemical composition of the water of the Dead Sea now.
How far from the Dead Sea is the Tal?
14 kilometers from the northeast corner.
Okay.
About 6 miles.
All right.
So now that, and just as another, by the way, the northeast end of the Dead Sea is southwest of our site. So we've got the walls being pushed in the northeast direction. We've got water being pushed in the northeast direction. Now, Mark Boslow at Sandia National Labs, he's well known for the computer modeling that he's been doing of meteoritic impact and airburst events. He put out a hypothesis in 2014 that an airburst event over a body of water would not only push would basically create a tsunami event that would push the water out and create a tsunami outward from it. So that could explain, if the airburst was over the north end of the Dead Sea, if that was ground zero, that would explain the directionality of the concussive force. It would explain pushing a tsunami, a miniature one, of course, because there's not that much water available, but it would push a tsunami of Dead Sea water up across the landscape, across the very flat, wide open plain, deep enough to inundate the lower tell, but not deep enough to make it all the way to the top of the upper tell.
Huh.
So that could explain why the lower tell is saturated with the salts and sulfates that are identical to what's in the water of the Dead Sea. So the next dot we then connect. So we've got a directionality associated with a highly concussive, extreme thermal profile event. And the only naturally occurring physical phenomena that can produce that are either a meteoritic impact or airburst event. Either of those could do it.
Mm-hmm.
There is, however, no crater in our area. The closest crater is 150 kilometers away, and it's southeast of our location, so that couldn't be the source. And the timing of that crater we don't know yet. It's much older than our event. But at any rate, that's why we lean towards an airburst event. We believe it was an airburst event because of the thermal profile, because of the concussive profile, because of the tsunami effect, because of the directionality that we're seeing, because of the amount of area that was taken out by this event. And it was, a very focused event, which an airburst tends to be, because you've got a momentum to the mass. You've got all of that. When the explosion occurs, that mass is converted to plasma. So, it's a very focused event that could very easily be limited to just the valley floor, because there is no evidence of any interruption of occupation on either the Judean plateau to our west or the Jordanian plateau to the east. So totally contained within the valley, within that circular plain. Now, the other thing that's explained, this concussive event not only blew the buildings off their foundations, but it also destroyed the topsoil, and then the tsunami from the Dead Sea then saturated the remaining subsoil with salts.
Which made it essentially poisonous to plants.
Exactly.
Toxic, yeah.
Exactly. So when we did the chemical analysis of the soil, what we discovered that in the ash layer of that Middle Bronze Age destruction event, we have 6% salts and sulfates from the Dead Sea.
Wow.
Now, why is that significant? I'll tell you why. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, if the level of salt contamination in the soil exceeds 1.3%, wheat will not germinate.
Huh.
If it exceeds 1.6%, barley will not germinate. Those are your two top cereal grains. If you can't grow cereal grains, you can't feed people, you can't feed cattle, you're not going to live there. We're at 6%.
And
in that destruction layer.
This area would have been, without that salt in the soil, would have been prime real estate back in the day, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. This is all bottom ground, and you know, for anybody out there who's a farmer, you know, it's the bottom ground. You know, in the valleys, that's where the good soil is.
Right.
And yes, this was a prime agricultural area. It is actually the best watered agriscape in the entire Levant down there. And so, yeah, all of that land, however, was taken offline for agricultural purposes because of the salt contamination. And it took 6 centuries to 7 centuries for that salt to be flushed out through. And again, we're in a very arid area, so annual rainfall is quite low. It took that long for the soil to recover. And when there was flooding, where we'd get enough new silt laid down from the heavy annual rains, it took that long to bury and encapsulate that contaminated soil. Wow. and rinse out what was left so that they could start growing cereal grain crops again. And they started growing it to about 5 kilometers to the north about 600 years later, and it took almost another century till they could actually start growing crops again in the immediate vicinity of Tal el-Hammam. But once they started growing it again, and it's again mostly barley, because there was still a relatively high salt contamination, they started growing it abundantly, so much so that they had to, dig all of these silos, and they were storing massive amounts of grain from the field, and a very large warehouse they built on our upper tell in order to store the processed grain as a distribution center. And because of that, they put a small garrison. But this is all 700 years later.
Okay, and that would be around the time of the rise of the David and Solomon, the Solomonic Davidic kingdom.
Yeah, it would have been during the period of Solomon, certainly, and then later. And then our site was taken offline again, again around the time of the Assyrian and later Babylonian invasion, and our site was never reoccupied after that.
Right.
At least not as an urban center.
This is fascinating stuff, and again, it's interesting that the author of the piece in Science News, just contained himself to calling this the settlements north of the Dead Sea instead of connecting it to Sodom. It was other authors, other writers, CBN News, Breaking Israel News, and sites like that instantly made the connection. And I mean, anyone who's familiar with biblical history would you see timeline 1700 BC, north of the Dead Sea. And make that connection.
Exactly.
Coming back to the dig site itself, what is it about the site that convinced Dr. Collins, and I've got a copy of his book here, Discovering the City of Sodom, and convinces you that he was correct in identifying this as the biblical Sodom?
Well, what got his attention, first of all, is Genesis chapter 13. Now, Dr. Collins was a very active archaeologist in Israel, and he was working at the site that has been identified as Ai. And if you remember the Abrahamic narrative, when he and Lot first come down from Mesopotamia, they come down into Canaan, and they stop at Bethel and Ai. And he makes a little altar to the Lord there. But there was famine in the land, so they continue on down into Egypt. This is all in chapter 13 of Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so they spend some amount of time down in Egypt, and their livestock is multiplied. They come out of Egypt, very wealthy men, and they wander back up north through the Negev, and they end up back at Beth El-Enai. And then we have that famous narrative about the arguments that break out between Lot's herdsmen and Abraham's herdsmen, and they decide they need to part company because although the famine is mitigating somewhat, there's not enough water, there's not enough grazing area for their flock, so they need to split up. So standing between Bethel and Ai, we have this discussion that takes place between Abraham and Lot, and basically Abraham makes the offer, if you want to go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you want to go to the right, I'll go to the left. Mm-hmm. And now, they don't have words in Hebrew for the cardinal directions, north, east, south, west. So although most of our modern ones, if you want to go north, I'll go south, that's a modern translation.
Right.
It's basically left, right, and then it says, and Lot looked up. Now, understand that when you talk about to the left and looking up, you're facing east. Mm-hmm. Their reference is east, not north like we do. It's east. And so left would be north, right would be south, and it says he looks up. In other words, he looks east, and that's when he looks across the valley from Beth El-Enai, and he sees that it's a very well-watered landscape. In fact, he describes it like the Garden of God. Mm-hmm. How is the Garden of God watered? Right? With streams, with springs, with a river running through it. And then he says, like the Nile. Because it just came out of Egypt. Well, how is the Nile watered? It's watered by the annual flooding of Egypt is watered by the annual flooding of the Nile River. They practice dry farming there, so that as the waters recede, they're planting their crops, and then they dry farm and harvest with the fall rains. Mm-hmm. Well, that's exactly what happens in the bottom of the Jordan. Well, it used to happen in the bottom of the Jordan Valley. You've got the Nile in miniature with the Jordan River. The same phenomenon would take place, where the Jordan River would flood and come out of its banks and go about halfway across the valley floor. That's why there are no urban centers in the middle of the valley floor. They're all up by the foothills on the edges. Mm-hmm. And then they would dry farm. And so it looks like the Nile in miniature. It looks like the Garden of God, which is Eden, and how Eden was watered. And so you've got the best watered agriscape in the entire Levant. And he decides that he's going to go east. So it says he packs up and he heads east towards Sodom, and he set up his camps around Sodom. So we know it's east of Beth El-Enai, and that's what caught Dr. Collins' attention, because he used to subscribe prior to that kind of encounter with the scriptures again. To what we refer to euphemistically as the Southern Sodom theory. Everybody has tried to put Sodom south of the Dead Sea, and that's because of a couple of really unfortunate word choices in the King James translation that led people looking for the wrong stuff in the wrong place. But that's another story for later. But at any rate, the scripture very clearly gives us the geographical clues to know where to go looking. It's just nobody bothered looking at the scripture, and nobody bothered looking where the scripture said to go. And so that's what attracted Dr. Collins' attention. And so he and a couple of two other couples that were close friends of his set about to do a walking survey of the floor. So they went over to Jordan, they went over to Acor, they studied all the reports, got the survey reports, had a top 12 list of a list of the top 12 candidate sites. And then they went and actually walked the ground. And like I said, the 600-pound gorilla staring in your face is that very large Tal el-Hammam. And just based on its size, that if that was Sodom, how was Sodom portrayed in Scripture?
Well, it was important enough that the kings from the east, the king of Elam, the king of Babylon in the day, and their allies marched all the way over from what is now southeastern Iraq and northwestern Iran to the Dead Sea in order to wage war against this city.
Exactly right. And it's portrayed as the controlling urban center of a city-state complex. That's how it's portrayed. And so you would expect it to be the largest urban center in the area. And by golly, it is. The next closest one is Tel Nebreen, which we believe could be a good candidate for Adma, is only 1/4 the size. So, and again, like I said before, Tal al-Hammam, the only other site comparable in size at that time was Hatzor. Some say Hazor, I say Hatzor.
Hatzor.
But anyway, yeah. Anyway, so, it was a big urban center. And it's got all of the markings, when we look at Tal al-Hammam, it's got all of the markings of a controlling urban center of a city-state complex. It's got its guardian cities encircling us with Tel Nimreen, Tel Rama, Tel Iktanu, Tel Kafrain. It's got all of the markings of a large urban center. And that is how Sodom is portrayed in the scripture. So that's what caught his attention. So based on the geographical clues coming out of the scripture, which, by the way, we have more geographical clues for the location of Sodom than we do for Jerusalem.
And I might also add more than the Quran has for Mecca, but that's another story as well.
That's a whole other story, too. Yeah, so, yeah. I mean, they're there if you'd only pay attention to the book and treat it as good geography as well as good history and not just myth and legend. So anyway, I digress. So right away, he began to understand that Tal al-Hammam was the right place based on the geographical clues. Now, 13 years, we're about to begin our 14th season of excavation at Tal al-Hammam. So 13 years later, not only is it the right place, but we're finding it's the right time. Sodom is first introduced in Genesis chapter 10. The context of Genesis chapter 10 is early Bronze Age, about 2500 BC. And it's named as one of the border cities of the region of Canaan. So for it to be named as a border city, it has to be a fortified city. In the early Bronze Age, early Bronze 2 is when they started building fortified cities.
Right.
And guess what? We have a fortified city going back to the early Bronze Age. I mentioned earlier that it was first settled in the early Chalcolithic, maybe late Neolithic period, so about 4500 BC. By the time you get to the early Bronze Age, we've got a fortified city. And so it has to exist as a fortified city, and our site does. It has to exist as a fortified city in the Middle Bronze Age during the time of Abraham, because Genesis 19:1, when the two angels show up, where do they find Lot? Seated at the city gate.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you don't have a city gate unless you have a fortified city.
Right.
We have a massive fortified city in the Middle Bronze Age. So it's the right place. It's also the right time. It fits the entire time frame for the whole biblical narrative that has anything to do with Sodom. But it also has the right stuff. It's got a large palace at the top. It's a large urban center. It's got all of the trappings of a very large, influential, controlling city, of a city-state complex. It's got the right stuff as well. And my contribution to Dr. Collins' narrative of right place, right time, right stuff is now what we're demonstrating is it's also telling us the right story. And what story is that? The destruction event in Genesis 19, verses 24 and 25. Everything that we are finding is totally consistent with that biblical narrative.
Fascinating stuff. Now, on a personal note, and this is because I've got you on the line, and this is an area that I find really interesting, and I wrote a little bit about it in my last book, the dolmens of the Jordan Rift Valley. I understand that it's estimated that there may have been at one time these funerary monuments, or whatever they are, these dolmens, these structures made of slabs of stone, as many as 1,000 of them around Tal al-Hammam at one point. What are they, and to what period of history do they date?
Well, they date back to the early Bronze Age, perhaps the late Chalcolithic period as well. So they date back to about 3000 BC. They are made of megalithic blocks of stone. In other words, big blocks of stone. Megalithic means, big stone. There's, if you can picture standing stones with a flat tabletop stone on top of it. And they appear to be family-centered funerary monuments for the ancestral family. Now, they didn't bury people there, but and we're not sure about this, but we think that the flat stone top was used for a process that's referred to as excarnation. Now, we all know what incarnation is. That's becoming flesh. We use that word a lot talking about Jesus. But excarnation is the actual opposite. When you take the flesh off the bones, that's excarnation. All right?
Okay.
And we believe that what the flat tops, tabletops were used for is that when a person died, they would put the body on top of the stone, and in a very short period of time, about 3 weeks actually, the birds of the air would come, pick all the soft tissue off the bone, and you'd have a nice clean skeleton 3 weeks later.
Okay.
They would then select 1 or 2 bones representing that person, and then once, maybe twice a year, probably at the equinoxes, they would open up the dolmen, add that bone to the ancestral bones, and maybe put in a few, offering trinkets, have a party, close the thing up, and then they leave it there till the next equinox. And so that's what we think the dolmens were for, because the few that we were able to excavate that had not already been robbed out, that's what we find. We find a few representative bones. We find, small pottery vessels, evidence of either grain or wine offerings or that kind of stuff. That's what we find inside the dolmen.
Huh. Now, how about their astronomical orientation?
There doesn't seem to be a significant astronomical orientation, but there is, however, a physical orientation that we have observed, that they all seem to be aimed at the lower tell of Tal el-Hammam.
Oh. Which
is where the temple was located. In the lower tell is sort of circular in shape. In fact, when you look at it from like Google Maps, it looks like a crashed Starship Enterprise.
Huh.
But the lower tell is that more or less round area, and in the geographical center is the temple complex, and a lot of the dolmens are oriented to face the temple rather than to face a particular geographical, like, for example, face west. Since you can't look east because of the cliffside, they're not oriented towards the west where the sun would set,
right.
But they seem to be focused toward the general direction of the temple at Tal el-Hammam.
That's really interesting, and I'll tell you why I find this so intriguing. In the research that I did, and based on the concept of the divine council, the idea that the gods of the ancient world were real. In other words, God meant what he said when he said to Moses, "On this night I will execute judgment on all the gods of Egypt." He wasn't talking about just destroying blocks of wood and stone. Fallen angels, demons, whatever you want to call them, entities that represented themselves as gods to the ancient world. During the Exodus, there are several places where the Israelites stopped, where the place names seem to indicate a connection to the spirit realm, one called Ovoth, which is based on the word Ov, which means spirit or spirit of the dead. Another called Ai Ha'avarim, which means ruins or heaps of the travelers. And the Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible describes travelers, especially in the context of Ezekiel 38:39, as traveler with a capital T, and some sort of spirit entity, rather than somebody just on vacation up and down the King's Highway. And in fact, when Moses was near the end of his life, God told him, climb this mountain of the travelers, mountain of the Avarim. In one of the Rephaim texts found at Ugarit, the Rephaim, which were considered spirits of the ancestral dead, especially the royal ancestors, the Rephaim were referred to as travelers or vagabonds. So when you connect all this together, it appears that plus the worship of Baal Peor, when Israel were in the plains of Moab, that these ruins of the travelers, ruins of the Avarim, heaps of the Avarim, might refer to these dolmens, these stones. And if these were oriented towards a temple at Sodom, well, then what was going on theologically, spiritually, religiously at Sodom that, above and beyond the stuff that we read about in the book of Genesis, that God might have found so necessary to put a stop to that he sent this meteorite to destroy the whole plain?
Oh, let me add something to bake your noodle here.
Okay.
Remember that Tal el-Hammam was destroyed 1700 BC during the time of Abraham.
Right.
It stood as a heap of ruin.
Yes.
For a very, very long time. And it stood still at the crossroads of the main caravan trails. So the trail of the travelers continued to go by the base of the tell, even though nobody was living there.
Right.
And for a very long time, it was a heap of ruins, and even referred to as a heap of ruins.
Can you see Tel el-Hammam from Mount Nebo?
Absolutely, and vice versa.
Oh, right.
And vice versa. We got a clear line of sight. We can see it very, very well. If the air is clear, you can see it very clearly, and you get a lot of dust coming up from the deserts of northern Africa. So it's usually a somewhat hazy view. But yes, we have a very clear line of sight. In fact, I've got a very good picture of Tal el-Hammam from up there.
Okay. Okay. Well, now I'm even more excited about our trip back to Israel and Jordan in May. We were there this past May, and of course we were up Mount Nebo, and was able to talk about the Valley of the Travelers, which Ezekiel refers to in Ezekiel 39 in the context of the Gog-Magog war. You know, the Valley of the Travelers east of the sea is where the army of Magog will be buried, according to the prophet. But if Tal el-Hammam is there, that adds even more context to it. So I'm really looking forward to going back and being able to do a little preaching up there on top of Mount Nebo.
Well, you should come out there in February sometime, because that's our excavation season, and give you a tour of the place.
I'm going to make a note of that. As we get older, Sharon and I are starting to do a little more traveling around. That's my wife. We'll be leading this tour in May. But if we can ever get there while you all are working at Tal el-Hammam, would love to have an opportunity to see that. Phil, you mentioned a book, and I know Dr. Collins has a book out. Are you writing a book about this event and your research there, or where can people find out more about this research connected to this air blast event 3,700 years ago?
Well, I do have a paper that is based on my talk that's available up at ResearchGate as well as academia.edu.
Okay.
So that can be downloaded. I do have a book out. It's based on my dissertation, so it's a little bit of an academic read, and it's now 3 years since I wrote it. So our research has gone on, and I will be doing an updated version probably in the next year or two, as time allows and as information comes in. But that book is available through TSU Press. It's not available on Amazon right now, but it's called The Destruction of Sodom, What We Have Learned from Tal el-Hammam and Its Neighbors. And you can contact me at TSU Press at outlook.com and order the book directly from TSU Press.
All right. Well, I'll put links in the show notes to that, also to your site at academia.edu, which I mine frequently for the research that I've been doing. In fact, that's become a fun Friday night pastime. Other people like to go out and dance or do whatever. For me, it's a fun Friday night finding a new paper on ancient Near Eastern cosmology.
Yeah, and half of your audience is thinking at this point, man, you need to get a life.
I know. Dr. Phillip Silvia, he is the field archaeologist and supervisor, director of scientific analysis for the Tal el-Hammam Excavation Project. You can follow the website at talelhammam.com. Is it .com or .org? I've got it open here and I forgot to...
.com, and if that's too much to remember, just go to digsodom.com.
All right, Dig Sodom.
It'll throw you right over to talelhammam.com.
Very good. Phil, I enjoyed the conversation. I'd like to do this again, especially as we get closer to your next book.
Okay, we can do that. I'll stay in touch.
Very good. Check the show notes at vftb.net for links to the academia site. I will also put a link there to the official site for the Tal el-Hammam Dig Project, the Tal el-Hammam Excavation Project, or THEP for short. They do look for financial support because Trinity Southwest University is not one of the major public universities, and of course, because it's presenting a biblical worldview, well, maybe I shouldn't represent that because he never said that. I don't see it on their site. But let's just suggest that perhaps they don't have the financing, the funding of some of the major universities out there. And so they do need to raise funds in order to continue the dig that they're doing at Sodom. or Tal el-Hammam, the official title. It's not been officially recognized as Sodom yet. I've been following their newsletter. You can follow the dig progress at the site through their daily updates. Dr. Stephen Collins sends out updates as what's been going on there. They are on site there now, Dr. Collins and his team, and they are searching for the archives. They're hoping that they can find an archive somewhere. Now, the site was blasted by something 3,700 years ago, which, according to the timeline that I've reconstructed in my research, that is smack dab in the middle of the timeline when Abraham and Isaac would have been living in the region. So the timing fits, the location fits, even though it's not the traditional location southeast of the Dead Sea. But the evidence fits. Of course, the problem is if there was something on top of the citadel there, say a palace for a local ruler, where they would keep mud brick archives of taxes collected or what have you. They were probably a stop along the King's Highway for the caravans heading north into Mesopotamia by way of Damascus, charging tolls, selling food and fodder for the animals and access to water and stuff like that, and getting wealthy that way. You know, keeping records of all of these things. It's possible that those records were just blasted into smithereens by whatever it was that exploded over the northeast end of the Dead Sea in 1700 BC. But we can help, we can pray, and we can offer financial support. So check the links at VFTB.net. If you're listening to this at Spreaker.com, I'll put those in the notes there as well. And follow the work and support it. This is fascinating stuff, science and archaeology, confirming the historical narrative of the Bible. See, our faith is based on history. And I think that is way cool. And Dr. Silvia is right. This does bake my noodle. We will be in Israel in May. We will be on top of Mount Nebo. And from there, we will see the Valley of the Travelers and Tal el-Hammam. If you're coming to Israel with us, get ready, because this is going to be a really exciting trip in a lot of ways. Tell you more about how you can join us and a new development, yet another exciting stop on the tour that God dropped into our lap this week. Straight ahead as A View from the Bunker continues.
Jack the Ripper's dark deeds actually began long before 1888. And it wasn't a mere man who committed the crimes, but a demon in league with devilish men, a group of men called Red Wing. Only one small group of valiant men and women stand against this evil, a group that place their faith in Christ alone, and they protect a secret of blood that Red Wing hopes to use to usher in the reign of Antichrist and the end of day.
Red Wing is called Red Wing because they want to kill the church. They want to forever stop Christ from coming back. So it's the Holy Spirit, the dove, with a murdered, has been slain, a wounded dove. Ultimately, we still have to remember that the one who is in control is God Almighty, and we have to go to Him, and we have to suit up every time we go out.
The Red Wing Saga by Sharon K. Gilbert. Book 1. Blood Lies. Book 2. Blood Rights. Book 3. The Blood is the Life. Book 4. Realms of Stone. And coming soon, Book 5. Realms of Fire. Available at SkywatchTVStore.com. And paperback and Kindle at Amazon.com. Characters you'll love and a story you can't put down. The Red Wing Saga by Sharon K. Gilbert. A new take on the prophesied war of Gog and Magog. Forget about Russia coming from the uttermost parts of the north. The enemy foreseen by the prophet Ezekiel is so much bigger and so much older. It's Last Clash of the Titans by Derek P. Gilbert, a #1 new release in Amazon's Christian history category. Last Clash of the Titans breaks down step by step how Greek mythology grew out of Canaanite religion, why the old gods of the Greeks, the Titans, were the watchers who descended on the summit of Mount Hermon, and why the Titans will return from the abyss for one final battle against God, Armageddon. Last Clash of the Titans, backed up by peer-reviewed academic research. Tom Horn calls this book stunning. Last Clash of the Titans, the second coming of Hercules, Leviathan, and the prophesied war between Jesus Christ and the gods of antiquity. Get it as part of a special offer at skywatchtvstore.com and available now in paperback and as a Kindle ebook at amazon.com. Driving the internet to think live every Sunday night. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Next week, we talk to a gentleman who's gone from the streets of Los Angeles to full-time television ministry. Mondo de la Vega, the executive producer of The Jim Baker Show, joins us next week here on A View from the Bunker Live. We got some exciting stuff coming up in the next few weeks. We're going to talk more archaeology in a couple of weeks. Aaron Judkins and Ty Towers. We're going to talk about music and ministry. The Chrysagas brothers, Sean and Brian, will be joining us on February 24th. And then on March the 3rd, Jim Barfield, founder of the Copper Scroll Project, will be here. And we'll talk more about that in just a couple of minutes. A few other news items just want to touch on in our final segment tonight. This is where I put all the oddball stuff that I think is interesting, but perhaps not, earth-shaking, so to speak. It was earth-freezing this week. Here in the United States, the upper Midwest was hit with record cold. One observer in Mount Carroll, Illinois, that's northwest Illinois, a little south of Dubuque, Iowa, recorded a temperature of minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. That is as cold, if that's confirmed, that is as cold as it's ever been in the state of Illinois. Temperatures at O'Hare Airport on Thursday morning were in the range of about minus 25 to minus 27 Fahrenheit. Wind chill factors in the upper Midwest, in Minnesota, were dropping below minus 50 Fahrenheit. That is just really, really cold. But what struck me, and I knew this was going to happen, it didn't take but a couple of minutes of searching to confirm that I was right, was that climate change evangelists, those who are convinced that we humans are responsible for changing the temperature here on planet Earth and making it warmer, immediately took to social media, Twitter, with all kinds of clever little tweets and memes about how anyone who could possibly think that the fact it was minus 30 in Minneapolis meant that somehow global warming wasn't real was just, a science denier. I mean, the science is settled. And besides, weather is not climate. Hashtag weather is not climate. If you searched for that Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday this week, you just saw it all over social media. Weather is not climate. Weather is not climate. Did you know that weather is not climate? The fact that the weather is cold does not mean that the climate is likewise getting cooler. Well, okay. We can agree. Weather is not climate. Climate has changed throughout history. Those of us who are skeptical about the anthropocentric cause of climate change do not deny that climate has changed over the centuries. The question is, how responsible are we humans for climate change? And the reason I question this is because I see a financial motive for researchers who are receiving billions of dollars in grants from governments and corporations who have a vested interest in a certain outcome to the research. And there have been plenty of questions about how well the research was conducted. How accurate is the information that is being fed back to us as justification for controlling our lives? You need to stop driving this kind of vehicle. You need to stop heating your house so warm. You need to stop cooling your house to a certain degree. You need to reduce your carbon footprint because you, energy hog American, are responsible for warming the planet, and we're all going to die in 12 years. That claim, by the way, actually made by an elected representative in the United States Congress earlier this week, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez of New York, who, again, thinks somehow we're going to do away with fossil fuels within a dozen years. Again, okay. Battery-operated jetliners. How are we going to get there? Nuclear power jetliners, maybe? I don't know. It's not going to happen. Now, I am not suggesting that we have a right to just, denude the planet, strip mine, and cut down all the forests. That's not it at all. Just saying, hey, look, before we start putting limits on what we can, and you notice how it's never the people who are making these decisions who are the ones who have to give up their SUVs and their private jets. You don't see Al Gore flying around in a battery-powered private jet or driving a battery-powered vehicle. Well, maybe he does. I don't know that for a fact. But certainly these guys who get together for these global summits on how to tell the rest of us to change our energy consumption are sure making a pretty big carbon footprint. I mean, hey, can't they video conference instead of all flying to, Dubai or wherever, or Rio de Janeiro? I am skeptical not so much about whether or not climate is changing. I'm skeptical about, A, how much impact humanity has versus, say, that giant flaming ball of gas in the sky, the sun. Secondly, skeptical about the motives behind the science and how accurately the climatologists can actually project into the future. There are a lot of factors that are not well understood. Read earlier this week, and I'm not a climatologist, nor do I play one on TV, but I can read. I've got pretty good reading comprehension. And when I read that the estimated impact on global temperatures by humans is 1/100th of 1%, and that is 0.01% of the impact of the sun in terms of watts per square meter, and that's assuming that we measure the energy the Earth absorbs from the sun accurately. The Earth's atmosphere absorbs from the sun. Because if the estimate of the sun's energy in the atmosphere is off by more than 1/100th of 1%, then the error in the estimate of the sun's energy in the atmosphere is greater than the estimated human impact on the temperature of the Earth's atmosphere. Which means, bottom line, the model is useless. And yet, we're supposed to give up our fossil fuels based on that science. So I'm not a science denier. Have a great deal of respect for science. But I'm also skeptical about the motives of other people, especially when there is money to be made. So, and by the way, let's just see when we get back into hurricane season this summer and fall, when hurricanes start hitting the Gulf Coast. And I pray that we don't see a damaging or devastating hurricane season. But if we do, if something major happens and we see tragedies and devastation in Florida and along the Gulf Coast like we saw this past year, you know that the climate alarmists who are telling us that cold weather does not mean climate change isn't real, because weather's not climate, suddenly we'll be hearing that weather is climate because hurricanes mean the oceans are warmer because SUVs. So, yeah, in fact, even this week, phys.org published a story. Warming seas may increase frequency of extreme storms. Mm-hmm. And just before the cold wave hit Minneapolis, St. Paul, Milwaukee, Chicago, and so on, the University of Wisconsin published an academic paper. So as the climate warms, as the climate warms, tens of thousands of lakes may spend winters ice-free. Again, that was released just before this polar vortex slammed the upper Midwest. That's what you call perfect timing. As we look forward to the end of days, because we do keep an eye on things of prophetic significance, and we do keep an eye on what our friends, brothers and sisters in Israel, the rabbis, are saying about the end times. It's interesting that you've got Orthodox and Haredi, what we might call ultra-Orthodox, but I understand that they consider that a derogatory term. The Haredi rabbis believe that they're starting to sound like evangelical Christians or conservative Christians who study end times prophecy, because rabbis who didn't previously make predictions about the fulfillment of end times prophecy are now doing it on a regular basis. So one of these, this is kind of a humorous story, so I'll share this with you. This is from BreakingIsraelNews.com, which reports on news in Israel from a biblical perspective, but from a Jewish biblical perspective. There was an article in a Hebrew language Haredi news service called Kikar HaShabbat about a rabbi's opinion on the role smartphones will play in the end times. A Haredi woman was concerned because her husband came home with a smartphone, which Haredi scholars, Haredi teachers, the rabbis, teach is an unkosher appliance. Okay? So this woman was concerned, so she wrote a letter to the rabbi asking for advice. And according to this woman's letter, she wrote that her husband told her, "I have good intentions. I believe the Messiah will arrive any moment, and I want to be among the first to hear about it. Smartphones get instant updates, and if I follow them, I will hear about it before anyone else." Well, she wrote to Rabbi Yitzhak Zilberstein, who is the head of the rabbinical court of the Rabat El-Hanan neighborhood in Bnei Barak, which is Jerusalem. And he had a very clear opinion of smartphones, and I quote from his response, "This claim is very ridiculous, and one is not allowed to fill his mouth with silliness in this world. You have nothing that brings ridicule like this stupid claim. Anyone who has one of these unclean devices, smartphones, will not only be the very last one to be updated concerning the Messiah, but he will not even hear about the arrival of the Messiah at all." But he went on and said, quote, "When the Holy Messiah arrives, God will bring upon us a spirit of holiness from above, and all of these impure gadgets will explode, and nothing of them will remain. The more impure they are, the greater the explosion will be. So, your husband believes he will be updated upon the Messiah's arrival, but there will be no way, no phone to update him, no phone number to reach him. He needs to pray that no harm will come to him from the device he now holds in his hand. Therefore, you can answer your husband that the more he stays away from these devices, the sooner he will hear about the arrival of the Messiah." End quote. Now, it's not my intention to mock Rabbi Zilberstein. It truly is not. I respect him for teaching according to his understanding of the Scriptures. As a Christian, I disagree with his interpretation. I recognize that the internet is a pipeline that can deliver the very best of humanity, but also the very worst. If you're a parent or a grandparent, do not let your child go to bed at night with that smartphone. You're letting people into your child's bedroom, your grandchild's bedroom, that you don't even know. I am thankful our daughter, a little too old to have had access to a smartphone when she was young. Anyway, Rabbi Zilberstein, I mean no disrespect. I disagree. I don't think there is, as a Christian, there is nothing we can do in terms of what devices we use or how we use them that earns favor with Messiah. As the Bible tells us, there is none righteous, no, not one. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. As John wrote to us, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. So setting aside our smartphones will not save us. But I do agree with the rabbi that they can be used for a lot of bad things, and the enemy will certainly use them to tempt us into bad behavior. It is interesting, though, the author of the piece at Breaking Israel News added one final comment. A Google search revealed another essential fault in the husband's claim. There are not currently any apps that claim to update the user about changes in the status of the Messiah. Now, true enough. The point here, and I did not mention this aspect of the story, but Rabbi Zilberstein is one of the Haredi rabbis, and again, that's ultra-Orthodox, although don't use that term when you're speaking to a Haredi Jew, that Messiah is already in the world. There is a belief among Jews, and that's why I'm bringing this story, because they believe that this is coming very, very soon. Messiah's arrival is imminent in their view. We as Christians understand he is coming back, but either way, there's no app that will send an alert or a text message when Messiah arrives. But hey, as Christians, we understand he's coming in the clouds with great glory. So we're all going to see him whether we've got access to 4K or 4G or 5G or not. It's not going to matter. So don't worry about the status of your smartphone or app. One final note. This was an interesting story from earlier in the week with a tragic ending, sadly. There's a location in Nevada called the Nevada Nuclear Test Site. Now called the Nevada Nuclear National Security Site. It's north of Las Vegas, about 60, 70 miles. And on Monday, about 5:18 p.m. local time, a man drove through a security checkpoint at Mercury, Nevada. Now, that's a closed city, only used by staff at this test site. And when he blew through the security checkpoint, paid contractors, security contractors, gave chase along with local law enforcement. Chase went for 8 miles before the car was pulled over. Man got out of his car with some type of metallic cylindrical object in his hand, and he confronted the security personnel and the sheriff's police. Would not respond to verbal commands, and so security personnel and law enforcement officers opened fire, and he was shot dead. Now, this site is operated by the Department of Energy under the National Nuclear Security Administration. It is unknown what this man was trying to do, what that cylindrical object was that he held in his hand, and frankly, we don't know this whether or not he was sober, to be quite honest with you. But a sad event and a mysterious event at a closed site called Area 23 north of Las Vegas. It was used for live nuclear weapons testing back in the Cold War. Now, I know that's 60, 70 miles north of Las Vegas, and I know that it was 60 or 70 years ago that this testing was conducted there, but it just seems to me that that's close enough to Las Vegas that if you're going to Vegas, you're gambling with more than just your money. Just saying. Anyway, a lot of exciting things coming up for us, us meaning Sharon and myself, in 2019. Our tour of Israel begins May 12th. And we found out this week that the founder of the Copper Scroll Project, Jim Barfield, is also leading a tour to Israel, and that his tour overlaps our tour by quite a bit. So we got to talking with Jim and Shelley Neese, who wrote the book about Jim's research, the Copper Scroll Project, and he has agreed to take our tour into Qumran. This is significant because the Copper Scroll, which was discovered in 1952, Jim believes, based on his experience as a trained arson investigator, that he has decoded the scroll. And while scholars have agreed for a long time that this points to a vast treasure located somewhere in the vicinity of Jerusalem, perhaps the temple treasures from Solomon's temple, buried to keep them out of the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. It's only since 2006, when Jim Barfield decoded the scroll, that we have an idea as to where these might be. So if you join us on our tour of Israel in May, you'll have an opportunity to hear about Jim's research from Jim Barfield himself and get a tour of Qumran as part of our tour. For more information, follow the link at VFTB.net. May 12th through 23rd. Join us. See Qumran, Mount Hermon, many other sites in the Holy Land. And if you take the Jordan extension, we'll go over to Mount Nebo, and we'll show you where Sodom is, Tal el-Hammam. VFTB.net for that link. The Last Days Online Conspiracy Summit, don't miss it. Our friends Ray and Tracy Gaino putting that on. There's a link at VFTB.net and my personal website, DerekPGilbert.com. An exciting week coming up this week on Skywatch TV as we talk about the Copper Scroll Project and brand new books by Carl Gallups and Tom Horn. Don't miss those at skywatchtv.com. Please, if you get a spare minute, leave us a review at Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever else you find us, which, of course, is wherever fine podcasts are sold. Give our Facebook page a like. And remember, A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House and released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Our opening theme is Iron Bacon by Kevin MacLeod, his website, incompetech.com. Our announcer, D.C. Good. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. Next week, Mondo de la Vega. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.